So one more time, super excited to finally get to see your presentation. We've been waiting all week, and Marlaine, you've been supporting so many different amazing people that I've gotten to meet this week also through World Unity Week. And so, yeah, super excited to have you here. Thank you for presenting.
Thank you so much for inviting us to present. You've just been fabulous supporting all of us. It's truly an honor and a privilege to link loving arms with so many amazing visionaries and heart-centric, compassionate souls around the globe that are nurturing a new, more unified and loving narrative for humanity. Hi, I'm Mama Marlaine. I am the founder of the International Consciousness Movement Parenting 2.0. In contrast to Parenting 1.0, which traditionally recognizes those with children in the home as parents, Parenting 2.0 recognizes every adult as part of the parental generation. Each of us are paying taxes. Those taxes are going to policing, to prisons, to wars, to hospitals, to schools. Each of us has a say in the viability of future generations. We also promote proactive education by qualified professionals for life skills used daily. What are life skills? Multiple definitions circulate. If you ask 10 people, you will hear 10 different answers. Parenting 2.0 embraces the simplest and most practical definition of life skills. We define a life skill as a skill every human being learns in some measure. Find a skill each of us learn, all 7.5 billion in birthing, and that meets Parenting 2.0's definition of a life skill. Examples: personal care, eating, sleeping, emotional literacy, communication and social skills, financial literacy, resource management. Even the poorest of children must manage living in the streets, must manage some measure of resources for food and shelter, or they will perish. Environmental literacy. Every human being living on the planet Earth breathes air, drinks water, disposes of trash in some manner. Once again, it's not that life skills are skills every human being learns, but not necessarily formally, not necessarily well. Life skills constitute our mandatory curriculum. The question is not, will you learn them? Simply, if you're alive, you are. The only question is, what is the quality of that educational process? Who are your teachers? Respecting life skills as the skills every human being learns distinguishes them as unique among all other skills. They are, in fact, the common thread in our humanity, the unifying fabric of all of us. Seemingly a thread that very recently has received a bright spotlight thanks to the COVID pandemic. Overnight, people around the globe were discussing core life skills topics: personal care, family, finances, environment, my family included. In addition to being the founder of Parenting 2.0, I am also the proud mother of 2 amazing adult daughters. And I'm going to tell a story, because that's the privilege of mothers, is we get to tell stories when they're emancipated. When my youngest daughter was 2 years of age, my husband and I were staying at a Marriott Residence Inn, a 600-unit Marriott Residence Inn in Rhode Island. He had just started a new position there, and he was leaving one Saturday morning for the office. It was early, it was around 6 a.m. And since our 4-year-old was sleeping, I stepped outside with our 2-year-old on my hip to kiss him goodbye. All of a sudden, I heard the loudest fire alarm I had ever heard in my life. And I happened almost instinctively to turn to my left. I don't know why. And I noticed, I hadn't noticed before that there was a fire alarm on the wall at my shoulder level. But I turned around, I saw it, and I noticed that Alexa had pulled it down. So I told my husband, oh, Alexa pulled the fire alarm. And he immediately said, okay, good. You know, he wasn't worried about a fire. I'm going to go to work. So off he went. And I took Alexa inside, welcomed my 4-year-old, told her it's okay, it's not a fire, and picked up the phone and called management and informed them that it was a false alarm. There wasn't a fire. My 2-year-old had accidentally pulled the alarm. And he said, I'm sorry, ma'am. He said, when an outside alarm is pulled, it's code. We have to, the fire trucks are already on their way. So I humbly walked outside and waited for the fire trucks. Not one fire truck came, not 2, not 3, 4 fire trucks. And I just sat there in shock watching them all. And in front of the 4 fire trucks was a car, a little white car with a siren on the top, which I guess, I don't know, the chief of the fire department, I don't know. Not only were there 4 fire trucks and the chief, all 600 units were simultaneously at 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning vacating. I was absolutely mortified. Today, with the world stopping normal activity to respond to COVID, I confess I'm feeling a similar bit of guilt. I know I'm not the source of COVID, but I have worked passionately for over a decade to get societies around the world to pay greater attention to life skills used daily and the accompanying educational process. So, and thanks to COVID, it is. Citizens around the globe are being forced to examine personal care, how we care for ourselves, how we care for our loved ones. We're being forced to take a good look at our emotional literacy skills. Families that perhaps spent very few real intimate hours with one another in a week's time are now weeks in a row quarantined together. Financial literacy skills, millions of people who previously were not impacted by the poverty on the planet, all of a sudden are without incomes. My own husband's company is headquartered in London, and they closed, we live in California, and they closed their California offices where he worked previously. But while the world is just now waking up in unity to the importance of life skills and the impact on our lives, the fact is millions have been suffering from the consequences of an impoverished life skills educational process and the accompanying low competencies. The bright spotlight on my own low competencies and life skills happened about 25 years ago. My husband and I had been married 4 years. We had, we just birthed Alexa, the 2-year-old. We just birthed her. I was about 2 months into her infancy. At that time as well, he'd started a new position, which he really didn't like, which is why he ended up leaving. So he was really unhappy. I was really tired. We were arguing. We had argued before, but this just put our arguments on steroids. And I didn't have any idea how to calm the flames. All I knew is I didn't want to argue in front of these innocent children. So I decided we needed a timeout, a separation. I got on the plane one morning when he was at work, and I flew with our 2 daughters back 3,000 miles west, back to my hometown of Seattle, where my family lived. My family was absolutely amazing in welcoming me, in understanding our difficulties. But even with all their understanding, I felt like a complete failure. I couldn't believe that I had arrived at this point in my life after really trying to do so many things right. You know, 4.0 in school, I worked as a professional. I just couldn't believe all that hard work had delivered me to such a miserable moment. And I couldn't eat. I literally ate almost nothing for weeks. I couldn't sleep. And one day, I simply exploded without any forethought, any prior consideration. I went through the house and took every pill I could find. That night, my heart stopped 3 times, but thankfully in the morning, I woke up and I had survived. When I woke up, there were leathers around my wrists and my ankles. And as I lie there, something really miraculous happened. The room filled with an energy of love that I had never felt in my life. It was omnipresent. It went through me. It encompassed me. I was part of that love. There were no boundaries between my body and the love that filled the room. And I somehow knew in that moment that the love had always been there, but I had been too busy listening to voices of man, listening to what I should do, what I ought to do, to hear it, to receive this loving energy of the universe, that somehow I knew it had always been there. I'd like to say I left the hospital and I became Mother Teresa and wore wings and was a wonderful person in the world. That was most definitively not the case. I did, however, leave the hospital with optimism, and I left it with compassion for my difficult time. And that was huge. Not only did I have compassion for myself, I also had compassion for other people. People who had great difficulties. Instead of seeing people in the lens I had previously of falling into categories of good and bad, all of a sudden I saw people more like plants, and people who were having difficulties, I respected them as struggling. I saw them compassionately. My husband and I, we reunited, we each went to therapy. We worked on increasing our emotional literacy competencies, and we reunited after a year and a half. This November, we will celebrate 35 years of marriage. A really important reason that we have succeeded in staying married the last 30 years, is the fact that we began to look at ourselves with compassion, to respect ourselves as learning, to get real about where we started in the journey, to commit to improving our skills, and just to have compassion and to give ourselves credit for small progress. We also worked very hard to impart our wisdom upon our two daughters. One morning, my 14-year-old, so a decade goes forward, my 14-year-old is leaving the house, and she didn't have her breakfast. I'm not talking bacon, eggs, and orange juice. I'm talking about a protein shake that would have taken her all of 30 seconds to consume. So I screamed at her. I said, "Ari Bree, you didn't have your protein shake." And she looked back at me and she said, "I don't have time." So I yelled even louder. I said, "You may be getting a 4.0 out of European history, but you are flunking personal care 101. And then I slammed the door. And I stood there, and that little voice, we have our inner voice, said, "Well, of course she is, Marlaine. She has a mad woman wearing a bathrobe, screaming at her for an educator." And I stood there and I realized it was true. I mean, why would she want to learn nutrition from a mother who was screaming at her? And I also stood there and thought about the fact that for academic, sports, and music, society routinely accepted the fact that you would learn those skills from a third-party professional who was trained in them. You would spend hours practicing. Failure was a normal part of the journey. My little one was a gymnast. She fell how many times learning to do a backflip on a balance beam? But when it came to life skills, society said, you will learn those from your parents, independent, their qualifications for teaching you. And children learn what they live. That's the operative paradigm, right? Role modeling from people never formally educated is the high bar of education for our most critical skills. So I decided if I wanted change, I would have to be the change. And I sat down at our kitchen table, and in about 15 minutes, I had rapidly written down all the skills, the really, really critical skills that society expected parents to be teaching children. And I looked at that list and I said, oh my goodness, I'm not an expert. I've never been educated in environmental literacy. I've never been educated. I was getting better at emotional literacy, but I still had a long ways to go. I'd never been formally educated in nutrition. I did have a certificate for being, I was a personal trainer at the time. So I was had a little bit there that other people didn't have. But mostly it was just very humbling to look at that and say, wow, these are the skills I'm supposed to be teaching my children. And what most typified the classroom, I'll be honest, was dictates and punishments. Clean your room, do your homework, eat your dinner, don't hit your sister. And if they didn't do it, some manner, we would, penalize them. What a terrible curriculum. And I knew I wasn't alone. I knew parents around the globe really were following a similar curriculum. And I thought, how sad. So we decided, I took out the life skills report card. I formatted it. Originally, it was just items, skills. But I decided since report cards were so widely respected, that I would format the life skills report card like an academic report card. There was, however, one really important difference between the life skills report card and academic report cards. In academic report cards, you have high points that mean you're doing very well and low points that mean you're doing poorly. On the life skills report card, I was very careful to stress to my children that every learning curve begins with low competencies. So if you're a 1, that's not bad. It's just saying that's where you are. That's where you're beginning your learning. And you make the goal of getting to a 2. You sit down and say, what are some things I can do? And we also started asking ourselves questions of how to enhance the curriculum from mom and dad's dictates and punishments. For many things we needed I was very candid with myself. I said, hey, I'm not high competency in these arenas, but these are critical skills. So let's bring in the wisdom of third-party professionals. So we really were raising them then with that growth mindset. Yes, mom and dad, they're not really high competency either, but we're committed to improving and, really demonstrating that over time. It's fascinating that at a time when we are brilliant enough to fly people to the moon, we still leave humanity's most critical skills to role modeling by people never formally educated. If you take particularly when you take any chronic social problem, obesity, wars, divorce, starvation, poverty, bankruptcies, pollution, take any chronic social problem and ask yourself, where do we learn the skills essential to prevent it? And the truth is, we learn it from parents rarely formally educated. I said at the outside that Parenting 2.0 recognizes every adult as part of the parental generation. Believing that one parent or even a combination of parents are going to be experts in all of these skills communicates a gross ignorance of life skills complexity and their importance in the 21st century. If we only take the skill of communication and the sub-branch in communication of digital literacy experts themselves are challenged keeping up with daily changes. Creating the life skills report card helped me to better respect the multiple life skills my children were learning, and appreciate that this was going to be lifelong learning, not 0 to 18, which under Parenting 1.0 model, by the time you're 18, people assume you have learned these life skills. We need look no further than the leaders of our government to know that growing 6'2" or 70 years of age does not give you high competency emotional literacy skills any more than it makes you a concert pianist. If you haven't learned it, you don't know it. Well, we are learning all the time. So this is actually critical because whatever we do often will be easier the next time we do it. If we learn to call people names, the next time we're in a situation, it will be easier to call people names. My daughters actually really applauded the life skills report card. They appreciated how the conversation in our home shifted from mom yelling and punishing to having a genuine conversation and discussing genuine means to improve the skills. And my eldest daughter encouraged me to share it with others. Well, needless to say, the fact that I had failed at suicide, I didn't really think I was the appropriate person to introduce life skills report card to the world. So I sent it into the Dr. Phil show. Dr. Phil had his doctorate. He was writing books at the time about life skills. And I thought, I'll just give it to him. He doesn't have to give me any credit. Just incorporate it into your curriculum and share it. And then I felt, I had benefited humanity in some manner. Unfortunately, I didn't hear anything back from the Dr. Phil show. So then I was faced with, does it just perish with me? Does this idea, this concept that enhances the life skills curriculum just perish with our family? And my eldest daughter again encouraged me. She said, Mom, create a group on LinkedIn. I knew nothing about LinkedIn. I knew nothing about group creation. In fact, I had the group for 3 months and a woman wrote me a letter and she said, are you going to accept me into your group or shall I withdraw my request? That was one of the greatest gifts I've received in my advocacy, years of advocacy, because I can't even imagine why she was so patient. But so I learned how to accept people into the group, and miraculously, the group just grew on its own. People who cared about life skills and believed they warranted more quality education started coming in, started flocking in. And one thing happened as I was observing discussions. One thing that was very common, even with people who had PhDs in child development, was referencing low competencies in a disparaging manner. For example, it was very common, even for people with doctorates, to call children bullies, to reference young women, drama queens, to call children tattletales. I still see this today. Imagine just for a moment that you've gone from 3rd grade multiplication and you're now in the algebra class, 8th grade algebra. Would you ever consider going into the 3rd grade class and insulting the 3rd graders? The fact that some people advance their life skill competencies and are not compassionate for those with lower competencies, in my humble opinion, means that they miss the most important part of class. Every learning curve begins with low competencies. So I learned in time, and many people told me, they said, we really appreciate when you're having a conversation, how you bring compassion. And I would try and say this, nicely to people because they're learning too, right? They're learning. So I would try and nicely point out how we want to respect every level of learning equally. And the beautiful thing that happened was that we had some amazing professionals, life skills professionals join the group. It has proved absolutely life-altering for me. The work that they do inspires me so much that it is the reason I'm here today doing this. And I'm going to give you an example of one of these educators who actually presented earlier today. Her name is Scarlett Lewis. Scarlett Lewis has 2 sons. Her youngest son had 2 sons. Her youngest son, Jesse, she kissed him goodbye, put him on a school bus on the way to school one day in December in 2012. That day, a young man by the name of Adam Lanza, who had attended this elementary school previously. Oh, I don't know if I mentioned her son, Jesse, was 6 years old. A young man who had attended the school previously entered the school that morning. This is Sandy Hook Elementary. in Newtown, Connecticut. And he proceeded to murder 20 children and 6 faculty members, as well as himself. This is a really good example of what happens in our society when we look at something like this. Most people looked at this and all they could say about Adam Lanza was, what an evil person, what a horrible human being, how unfathomable that anyone would do something so heinous. Scarlett Lewis, by contrast, said what on earth happened to this young man that he was hurting so bad that he would commit such a horrible crime. And this is important. She looked at it. It doesn't mean she condoned it, but she looked upon what occurred with compassion rather than condemnation. And this is critical because it led her to a different solution. Instead of saying, we need to jail everybody, we need to jail more people, she looked at his life. She asked what had happened, and she found out he'd been bullied horribly in school. He suffered from extreme anxiety. He sat in the lunchroom alone with no friends, nobody noticing, nobody paying any attention to him, and literally shook with anxiety. And the janitor was the one person who comforted him. So he was suffering for years. And when she learned this, she decided to create a social emotional literacy curriculum for schools called Choose Love. And the beautiful thing is these skills are teachable. And when we teach children emotional literacy skills as passionately as we teach them math literacy, imagine every year you have a different social emotional literacy curriculum. Her program is now in over 90 countries. And this is why it's so important to realize if our lens is just one of good and evil and condemnation, what opportunities for compassion, what opportunities for positive change for humanity are we sacrificing? Meeting people like Scarlett and so many others just inspired ever greater service for me. In 2012, members wanted to have an international conference. And I originally said, oh my goodness, am I going to say yes to this? But I loved everybody so much that I did. But we did host it in my hometown, which was then San Diego. I was so shocked that people came from as far away as England, from Sydney, Australia. I was absolutely shocked. At that time, we were just 800 members. I didn't have a best-selling book. We were really nobody we were just this little group on LinkedIn. And yet people were so passionate about elevating life skills education. So we had our first international conference in San Diego in 2012, our second in 2014 in Dublin, our third in 2016 in Goa, India, and our fourth in 2018 in Sydney, Australia. At the Sydney, Australia conference, I actually had to leave. Oh, this is tough. I had to leave my daughter's, my eldest daughter was birthing my first grandchild. She was actually in labor, hard labor, in the hospital room when I stayed there till the last possible minute. It was in San Francisco, but then I needed to go to the airport and catch my flight to Sydney. And the way that I was able to get on that plane was because I told myself that my daughter was fortunate. She and her husband knew the importance of life skills education. She and her husband have resources. She and her husband were going to embrace wisdom of third-party professionals while teaching their children life skills. She and her husband knew the value of a growth mindset. She and her husband knew that life skills would be a skill you continue learning throughout your life. But billions of children did not have that privilege because life skills education belongs to the fortunate few. And the fact that our most critical skills are something only for the fortunate few and that billions go without that, and that most of our chronic social problems stem from that impoverished educational paradigm. That's what inspired me to go. We have a lot of reason for optimism, for changing the life skills educational process. And my primary inspiration comes from those that 300 years ago looked at academics, many children, and it's still happening across the world. But back 300 years ago, 12% of the population could read and write. Today, over 95% of adults under the age of, or individuals under 25 can read and write in just 300 years. How huge is that? How much did that free individuals to be creative, just to be able to read and write, to be able to be creative, to tap into their divine, miraculous minds, rather than maybe doing some menial labor. And I honestly do not believe any labor is menial. I think everything we do on the planet is the energy and gratitude with which we approach it. But I'm just saying, to have the demarcation be the people of privilege would learn to read and write, and billions would not. So it's very inspiring me. It's inspiring to me that what a small group of people did for academics in the 20th century. And it gives me great optimism that we can achieve the same emancipation and equality and equity for life skills education in the 21st century.